This is a walkthrough of the setup and configuration of the Panorama plugin for Cisco TrustSec for integration with Identity Services Engine. Prior to this plugin becoming available, in order for Palo Alto Firewalls to integrate with ISE, MyMeld, along with a community-supported application known as GridMeld, were needed for the integration. With this plugin, there is now native integration with ISE through Panorama. This demo will go through the setup of the plugin and show how quickly security group tags can be leveraged on Palo Alto Firewalls for enforcement. Before diving into the setup, let's take a look at the lab environment. The Cisco TrustSec plugin is supported with Panorama versions 9.0.3 and above. In this lab environment, all Palo Alto solutions are running PanOS version 9.0.6, which is the preferred PanOS release at the time of this recording. The PA220 is attached to the device group Edge to simulate an edge firewall, while the VM series belongs to the device group Data Center to simulate enforcement in and out of the data center environment. When a user logs onto the network, based on the credentials provided, ISE will assign an SGT to that particular endpoint. ISE will then share the SGT to IP address mapping with Panorama using pxGrid. The Cisco TrustSec plugin will push the SGT to IP address mapping to the firewalls based on the device groups defined in the plugin's notify group. The SGT to IP address mapping is then consumed by the firewalls for enforcement through dynamic address groups. On both firewalls, there are predefined policies with dynamic address groups as indicated here. For example, the nurses dynamic address group from an outbound internet perspective will be denied ICMP, will be denied access to any URLs associated with gambling, and for the data center, they will be denied access to the X-ray records. Security group tags that map to the student's dynamic address group will be denied ICMP outbound, denied access to any URLs related to alcohol, and will be denied access to student records in the data center. An SGT associated with the doctors group will be allowed access for everything outbound, ICMP, and all URL categories, and they will be allowed access to the X-ray records in the data center. Similarly, someone who is mapped to the educator's dynamic address group will be allowed all access outbound and will also be allowed access to the student records in the data center. Now let's take a look at some of the existing configurations in the various elements of the lab. First, we'll take a look at Identity Services Engine. The ISE version that's running is ISE version 2.6 patch 4. Under Administration Deployment, I have a single ISE node, and the single ISE node is performing all of ISE's functionalities such as admin, monitoring policy service, and the pxGrid service is enabled for this node as well. Under Administration pxGrid Services, I do not have any subscribers to pxGrid at this time. Under Work Center's TrustSec Components, these are existing security group tags that have been defined on ISE. Under Policy Sets, for this setup, we'll be working with the wired.1x. So within the wired.1x policy set, we can take a look at the authorization policies. And these are the authorization policies that we'll be primarily working with. So when a user logs onto the network and they provide credentials as a doctor, they're going to be allowed access onto the network and they're going to be assigned a security group of doctors. Similarly, if a user logs on and to provide the credentials belonging to the AD group nurses, they're going to be assigned a security group of nurses and professors and students, etc. On the Palo Alto side, This is the VM series that is acting as the data center gateway. Right? I'm running version 9.0.6. Here is the PA220. Again, that's running version 9.0.6, and this is simulating an internet edge firewall. For Panorama, I'm running version 9.0.6 as well. Right? If I go under the Panorama tab here, under Summary, you can see that both the PA220 and the VM series has been added to Panorama. For the device groups, I have two device groups created, the device group Edge and the device group of Data Center. The Edge device group is assigned to the PA220, while the Data Center device group is assigned to the Palo Alto VM. Let's start the setup of the Cisco TrustSec plugin. Under plugins, we will just do a search for Cisco. Okay. You can see there are a couple of Cisco plugins available. I think one is for the ACI integration for Panorama, but this is the one that we are interested in, the Cisco TrustSec plugin, and we'll use the latest version of 1.0.1. Let's go ahead and download it. Pretty quick download, and we will install the plugin. Here you can see the plugin has been successfully installed. The Panorama management interface will refresh to make the plugin available to us for configuration. Okay, here you can see on the left, we now have the Cisco TrustSec plugin available within Panorama. Right. So prior to setting this up, we will need to access Panorama CLI to create and activate the PXGrid client username and password that will be used to subscribe to the PXGrid service on ISE. So I'm logging to Panorama here. So to create the username and password for the PXGrid service, I'm going to request plugin Cisco TrustSec create account. I want to disable this server verification because it uses username and password for the PXGrid subscriber anyway. So I'm going to do no. The host is going to be the IP address of ISE. And the client name that I'm going to use, I'm going to call it Panorama. All right. So you can see the Panorama account has been created. Here is the client password. I'm going to copy this because we'll need it for the setup in the GUI. And it says, please approve the account on the server. So that means that we need to go to Identity Services Engine. Under Administration, PXGrid Services. Right. And here you can see the client name of Panorama with the status of pending. So I'm just going to approve this on ISE's side. Right. So now the Panorama user is an allowed subscriber of PXGrid services from ISE. Back on Panorama, let's go and configure the plugin. Under General, we're going to enable monitoring. I'm going to leave it at the default of 60 seconds. For the Notify group, so this is the device group that Panorama will notify when it receives an SGT to IP address mapping. Right? So I'm just going to call this ISE Notify group, and I'm going to select both of my device groups here, edge and data center. For pxgrid server, I'm going to call this ISE underscore pxgrid. Okay. The host Panorama is the client name, and the password is the one I copied earlier. Okay. I'm not going to verify server certificate here, and I'm going to push OK. Right. Under monitoring definition, I'm going to add a definition. Let's call it ISE monitoring. Here you can see the ISE underscore pxgrid server that I created earlier. By default, the plugin will monitor the pxgrid sessions in startup state. Here you can select if you want to monitor it in authenticated state. I was going to leave it as a default for the started state. And for the notify group, I'm going to choose my ISE notify group that I created earlier. Hit OK, and we'll commit this. The configuration has been committed. Just do a quick refresh here. You can see right away I receive a success message indicating that Panorama is now an active subscriber to pxgrid. So from a setup perspective, this is really all that's needed to integrate Panorama with Identity Services Engine. Now let's see the plugin in action, and we'll walk through some examples of SGTs being utilized for enforcement. On my ESXi host here, this is the Windows host that we will be testing with. I'm going to log into this host as nurse1 for this first example. Okay. While that's logging in, I'm also going to establish a command line session to both the PA220 as well as the VM series. In the background here, you can see that as nurse1, I successfully authenticated and have logged in to the network on this particular host. On ISE, if we go to Operations Radius Live Logs, you can see here that the latest authentication session for nurse1 is here. If I scroll to the right, you can see security group tag of nurses has been assigned, and the endpoint is 10.0.11.100. Now on the command line of both firewalls, I do a show object registered IP all. You can see the firewall has learned about this SGT to IP address mapping. So what this is saying is the host 10.0.11.100 has been assigned a tag of cts.svr_ISE_pxgrid.sgt_nurses. Okay? So the syntax here is Cisco TrustSec, and the server is ISE_pxgrid, and the actual SGT is nurses here. So this SVR ISE_pxgrid, if we go back to Panorama and go to the setup, you can see it's referenced here under the pxgrid server, ISE_pxgrid. Now, if you recall the notify group, both device groups, my edge and data center, that's included in notify group. And so that's how the firewalls are learning about the SGT to IP address mapping. If we take a look at the actual firewalls themselves, let's go to Objects and under Address Groups. So these dynamic address groups I previously, what were previously defined. Since we're working with the nurse1 user, I'll bring up this dynamic address group. You can see that this address group is called nurses_SGT, and it's being mapped to match the SGT that is learned from ISE from the plugin. Right. So if I bring up the command line again, okay, you can see cts.svr ISE _pxgrid SGT nurses. Right. And if I do an add match criteria, you can see these other dynamic listings here were, when I was first testing the setup, these were the other security group tags that the firewall has learned about. And I used these mappings to create these dynamic address groups. So for the doctor's SGT, it's being mapped to SGT of doctors. Educators SGT is being mapped to the SGT of professors. Students SGT is being mapped to the SGT of students. From a policy enforcement perspective, if I go to policies, and right now I'm filtering based on showing only the policies for this SGT demo. This line, I'm denying ICMP outbound for anything that has been assigned to the nurses or the students' dynamic address group. So it's denying ICMP. For nurses, I'm denying access to gambling content. And then for students, denying access to alcohol content, and then allowing everything else outbound. So on my test host here, again, I'm logged in as nurse1. If I ping outbound, so I don't get a successful ping. And if I try to access any gambling related websites, you can see I'm being blocked. Vegas betting lines, right? Try that again. Yep, VegasBettingLines.com, that's blocked as well, right? So on the firewall, if I go to the monitor tab, and I'll filter for this host, and let's say anything that's not allowed. Okay, we should see here are my ICMP denies, as well as my deny for access to gambling sites. For the data center, I have the same address groups defined. The nurses SGT dynamic address group is mapped to the SGT of nurses. And from a policy perspective, I'm denying nurses access to the X-ray server that's located at 172.16.100.10. So if I go back to the host here, ping xray.demo.local. See, I'm denied access. And that's not being resolved either, right? If I can go to the monitoring tab here, here are all my drops for denied nurses. So let me log off as a nurse, and we'll log in as a doctor to see what the effect would be. Switch user. Log in as Dr. 1. Successfully logged in as Dr. 1. Let me go to ISE. We'll do a refresh here. We can see that doctors has now been assigned a security group tag here. Same IP address, 10.0.11.100. If I go left, you can see Dr. 1 is now the user logged in on that particular host. On the command line of the firewall, if I do a show object register IP all, we can see doctors has now been updated to reflect the doctor's SGT. Same IP address, doctor's SGT. Take a look at the other firewall. So if we try to access the same sites in ICMP, notice that now I can, as a doctor, I can ping outbound. Let me try to access poker.com. As a doctor, I'm not restricted to any URL categorization. And so you can see I now have access to poker.com. And for the X-ray records within the data center, you can see now I can access the resource within the data center as well. Okay, so here you see I can access the X-ray as a doctor. One more example here. I'm going to log off as doctor. Okay, so just want to show something really quick. When the machine is at the control delete prompt, right? Notice here on ISE we can see just the endpoint identity. There's no username associated with that. And there's no security group tag associated here. So on the firewalls, if I do a show object, notice that there's no registered IP as well. So it updates both firewalls relatively quick with regards to whether there's a security group tag or there's no security group tag, depending on where the endpoint or the user is in the authentication process with Cisco ISE. I'm now going to log in as a student. So we'll do student 2. Okay, student 2 has successfully logged in. Go to ISE. I'm going to refresh. We can see here students security group tag has been assigned. IP address is the same, 10.0.11.100. Further left, and the identity is now student 2. On the firewalls, show object register IP all. Okay, you can see students SGT, IP address here for the edge firewall, as well as for the data center firewall. Now, if you recall, my policy for a student is it's going to be denied ICMP and also denied access to any alcohol-related content. So back on this host, this time I'll try to ping 8.8.8.8, and that's denied. Open up a browser here. And I'll try to go to budweiser.com. Application blocked. On a 220, go back to the monitor session. We should see my ping 888 that's being blocked, as well as deny access to any alcohol-related content because I'm logged in as a student. For the data center, under policies, students are denied access to this particular resource, 172.16.100.11, which is the server that's simulating student records. So ping student demo.local. Oh, students. There we go. On the monitor tab, you can see policy deny students for both ICMP and web access to that particular resource. I'm going to log off as a student. And now I'm going to log in as a professor. Professor 1. Now while this is logging in, if you recall, the professor is part of the educators dynamic address group. And on the edge firewall, it has all access. On the data center firewall, educators have access to the student record server. So going back to my host here, the Professor 1 has successfully logged in. On ISE, hit a refresh. See Professor 1 has logged in. Security group tag of Professor, and the IP address remains the same. On the command line of both, here we go, Professor's SGT. Oh, I was going to ping 8.8.8.8.8. Okay. As a professor, I have unlimited access, so I can access 8.8.8.8 via ICMP. Now I have access to Budweiser.com. Within the data center, see, I can resolve to the 172.16.100.11. Here I have access to student records. So one last example here is learning about a new SGT from Cisco ISE and how that can be used for policy enforcement. So on this host, I'm going to log off a professor. While this is logging off, recall under objects here, if I go to educator SGT, add match criteria, currently there's 4, doctors, nurses, professors, students. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in as teacher 1. So teacher 1 has successfully logged in on this particular endpoint on ISE. I'm going to do a refresh. Here we can see the security group tag of teachers has been assigned same IP address 10.0.11.100. And we can see teacher 1 here. On the firewalls, we can see 10.0.11.100 has now been mapped to teachers. If we go back to this, either firewall here, okay, I want to add match criteria. Let me cancel that. Add match criteria. Notice that teachers is now available to me to add to a dynamic address group. Okay? So I can, for this educator's SGT, I'm going to use the OR and say, as an educator, dynamic address group is going to be either professors or teachers, and hit OK. So as a teacher currently, based on the policies here, I shouldn't have access to this particular resource because I haven't committed that change yet. Just ping students.demo.local. Here you can see the ICMP is not successful. Let me kill that. And let me just commit this change. The original ping from the user logged in as teacher 1, it was denied because I didn't have a policy that explicitly allowed it. We committed the SGT of teachers to belong to the educator's dynamic address group. So now from a policy perspective, we can see teacher 1 now has access to the students.demo.local server in the data center. And if I bring up a web browser and go to students.demo.local, I should, as a teacher, now have access because the teacher's SGT is mapped to the educator's dynamic address group. Here you go. And if I do a refresh here in the monitor tab, you can see allow educators is the policy that's allowing teacher 1 to access the student records resource. So I hope this walkthrough has been helpful for the setup of the Cisco TrustSec plugin for Panorama and demonstrating the capabilities of security group tag with dynamic address groups as a method for policy enforcement. Thank you for watching.